Today on Under the Big Tree, exploring West Coast synthesis with the amazing Verbos Complex Oscillator. Money is tight for most of us, and Eurorec is far from an inexpensive hobby. It becomes easy to try to build your system by getting inexpensive modules, but every once in a while, it makes sense to buy one thing that's expensive, realizing that it has way more functionality packed into it than a series of smaller modules that cost less money. The Verbos Complex Oscillator is an example of just such a module. I was in my favorite synthesizer store last week, Perfect Circuit in Burbank, California. I was returning a module that I didn't like very much and that wasn't working for me. And I realized when I came in that there was a store-wide flash sale going on. I looked through the catalog to see the things that were on sale and stopped as soon as I saw the name Verbos. I realized that they were selling the Verbos Complex Oscillator on sale, and in addition, I had the store credit from the module that I was returning that I didn't want. Well, I thought it through for a little while and decided to throw caution to the wind and pick up the Verbos Complex Oscillator. Let me tell you, I am so glad that I did. It is by far my favorite oscillator, and in fact, probably my favorite Eurorec module altogether. Why? Because it has three modules packed into one thing. A main oscillator, a modulation oscillator, and a wave shaping module. Those things all work together and integrate to be able to create incredibly complex and rich timbres. The sound quality is sublime. The knobs are a joy to twirl. The user interface is incredibly simple and easy to be able to figure out, and it's just a lot of fun to play with it. So we're going to spend this episode exploring West Coast synthesis with the Verbos Complex Oscillator, seeing all of the power and amazement that it can bring to your Eurorec system. Okay, here it is, the Verbos Complex Oscillator. I hope you will indulge me in letting me do an unboxing of this incredible piece of Eurorec goodness before we take it upstairs and have a listen to it. So what do we get here? The receipt, which was too much money, but it was on sale and I had a store credit, okay? All right? Okay. And then the operating manual. Ooh, a little sticker inside. Something that tells you exactly how the thing works. Not a very heavy-duty manual there. I believe it's one piece of cardboard, but that's okay. Shows a block diagram of what the whole thing is. And your standard Eurorec power cable, your standard Eurorec screws, but because of the fact that it's Verbos and it's awesome, they include little rubber washers to be able to keep the screws from scratching the surface of the oscillator. And then there's the oscillator itself, wrapped in bubble wrap. Without further ado, there it is. All right, there it is. I can just see from feeling it that the paint is absolutely beautiful. The knobs are gorgeous. The feel of the throw of the knobs is something else. The user interface is incredibly easy to parse, very simple to see everything, and that's wonderful. Let's take a look on the back. We have all surface mount stuff with a couple of trim pots there, one for amplitude modulation and one for timbre, but lots and lots and lots of surface mount ICs just all over the place, and then a power connector right there, and then the connections to the unit itself. So that's all there is to it. Let's plug it in and see what it does. Okay, so here is the Verbos Complex Oscillator. To call it just an oscillator is somewhat of a misnomer because it's actually three modules in one. There is the master oscillator right here, which is actually the oscillator that you hear. There's a modulation oscillator right here, which is sort of like an LFO, but it comes up into audio range as well. And then finally, there's a wave shaper. The wave shaper really allows you to vary the harmonics and partials of the oscillator to create even more interesting and complex waveforms. Now this oscillator is really the West Coast, quote-unquote, approach to synthesis, as opposed to the East Coast version. The East Coast is where you might take a harmonically rich oscillator, perhaps using a sawtooth wave, and then run it through a low-pass filter to be able to adjust the partials in the timbre. In the case of a West Coast oscillator, something popularized by Don Buchla, you start with a more harmonically simple waveform, and then you add harmonics to it by adding either frequency modulation, amplitude modulation through another oscillator, or through doing wave shaping, or through a combination of the above. So it's a completely different approach to synthesis. It creates a very different sound, and it's a very different way of thinking, but it creates really interesting and beautiful sounds as well. So let's start with the middle section here, the most important section, just the master output. So to start with, we have a triangle wave, a pulse wave, a sine wave, and then we have what's called master, which with everything else down just looks pretty much like a sine wave, but is used for the wave shaping section over here. So let's have a listen through these things. Turn on our samp. There we go. So here is our sine wave, and you can see that this nice big frequency knob right here changes the volume. There's also a little fine-tuned knob right next to it, which is great. So there's our sine wave. There's our pulse wave. And you can see on the scope that the pulse is not exactly perpendicular, but I'm not sure whether that's the actual pulse wave itself or whether it's the oscilloscope. And then finally, here's our triangle wave. The triangle wave is a little bit brighter than the sine wave, but nowhere near as bright as the pulse wave. Then finally, let's go take a look at the master output right here. And if you see, it looks pretty much like a sine wave, but for some reason, there's a little bit more roughness around the peaks and troughs. I'm sure that has something to do with the additional electronics that is going through it. Actually, we'll start by listening to the modulation oscillator. So the modulation oscillator has also got a triangle wave, and you can bring it up to something like 500 hertz or so. So you can bring it up into the audio range, although you can bring it down, and there's a lot of throw there for the low frequency range. I believe that it's got a cycle as slow as 1 hertz per minute, which would be amazing for doing really long, slow ambient kinds of things. But let's bring that up to here so we can actually see it on the scope and hear it. So there's our triangle wave. There's our pulse wave. And there is a sawtooth wave. Now, I'm not quite sure why there isn't a sawtooth on the master oscillator, although I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that you can get fairly close with the wave shaping. So now we've got this modulation oscillator over here, which is feeding the master oscillator over here. Let's take a quick sec to look at what the other inputs are on the master oscillator. Down here, we have a frequency modulation input with an amount, right? So this is an amplification of frequency modulation input. You don't need to use that if you're going directly from the modulation oscillator over. It'll just send it sort of behind the scenes, which is great. It's got a control voltage input with an attenuverter that you can use for the pitch of the oscillator, and then it's got a 1 volt per octave input so that you can send sequences and so forth to it. So let's have a quick look at using an LFO into the CV input. So there we have a sawtooth wave, and you can see how it's changing the frequency. And we can attenuvert it, and it'll go that way, or we can go all the way this way. So fun shade. Oh, shades of Pac-Man. There we go. Let's go and play some video games. Okay, and we can take that same LFO and we can actually put it into the frequency modulation input. And as you can see, it's changing the frequency of the waveform And the higher up we go with it, the faster that'll go. Until we get up into the audio range up there. But the nice thing about this complex oscillator is that you don't need an LFO or a separate device to do that kind of thing. You can do it all behind the scenes right here. Okay, you hear the terms frequency modulation and FM and amplitude modulation bandied about all the time. But what do they actually mean? Well, they mean pretty much what they say. Frequency modulation is where you modulate the frequency of the primary waveform. The amplitude modulation is where you modulate the amplitude of the primary waveform. They both create sidebands or additional harmonics that change the timbre of the sound, but they do them differently and they sound different. So before I get into exactly what the switches do, let's actually visually take a look at what those are. Let's start with frequency modulation. So we're going to turn on, we're going to turn that way down. There we go. Look at that. So you can see, let's turn that off for a sec. So there is our initial sine wave. And then we turn on frequency modulation, and the LFO of the modulation oscillator is changing the frequency back and forth. You can see that as the waveform gets shorter on the oscilloscope, that means that its frequency is going up. And that happens because of the fact that it's being frequency modulated. Now let's hear what happens when we turn this up out of LFO range and above 20 Hertz into the audio range. Let's go real slow. There we go. And now we start hearing sidebands. We start hearing much more complex sounds. Turn it up quite a bit. And you can hear how those FM sounds create sort of clangorous timbres. They create all sorts of weird additional harmonics that are not necessarily even numbered partials. Very cool. Now let's do the same thing with amplitude modulation. So we're going to do the same thing, and now, amplitude modulation only works with the master output for some reason. And there it goes. And watch, now we can see that the actual amplitude of the waveform is changing rather than the frequency of the waveform. So I'm going to turn it up. And as I turn it up, you hear sort of a tremolo effect, where it actually gets to the point where it's almost completely silent. And once again, we can change the frequency and go from a tremolo effect, once we get up into the audio bands, into something with very different sounding sidebands. Interesting. You can get to somewhere that's, some sort of a whole number partial of the original waveform, and it'll create sounds that are a little bit more in tune, quote unquote. And then as you move up, they get more and more dissonant and clangorous. Let's bring the modulation index all the way up. So now we have the frequency, we have the modulation oscillator doing amplitude modulation as strongly as possible on the main oscillator. And when we get down around here, you can hear that it sounds a lot like ring modulation. So already there are so many different interesting sounds that we can get out of this single module. So now that we've kind of delved into what amplitude modulation and frequency modulation are, let's go through all of the controls here on the modulation oscillator. So this black section in the middle is sort of the connection between the frequency, between the modulation oscillator and the main oscillator. So if we start up here on top, you can see that there is a sync switch. And what that does is cause the modulation oscillator to sync and have a multiple frequency or even divisor frequency of what's going on in the main oscillator. So we can hear what that sounds like. How different is that? You can hear there are these discrete frequency ranges that it goes through as it tries to sync the modulation oscillator. Let's turn that off. Totally different sound. And a continuous sound, whereas when it's synced, you can hear those discrete shifts. Sync isn't really, it's not really my favorite. I think I like it when they're unsynced and you create much more interesting sounds out of it that way, but it's got its uses as well. So sync is just on and off. Next here, this switch goes back and forth between the two modes that I just showed you. Amplitude modulation and frequency modulation. And when it's in the middle, it's nothing. Now here, this is interesting. Now we can switch between 3 different waveforms of the modulation oscillator on the frequency oscillator. So everything we've done so far has been with a triangle wave, and you can see that it's just sort of wavy but smooth. What happens if we switch to a pulse? Ooh, very clicky, and we start getting much more sort of stringent kinds of sounds more quickly. So really ring modulation kinds of sounds there. And then if we go with a sawtooth, it's sort of halfway in between. Let's do the same thing on the FM side. So there's our Pac-Man sound, speed it up a little bit. Then let's switch over from triangle to square wave. And there you get like a European siren or something. And it's fascinating, you can see on the screen exactly how it's going between different frequencies very quickly. So as we speed that up, it just goes crazy. And now let's do the same thing with sawtooth. And as we get into audio band, once again, you can hear that it's, you know, dissonant and clangorous sounding, but not nearly as much as the pulse waves. So, Yamaha was the company that really popularized frequency modulation and was able to find a way to be able to use it with synthesizers back in the 80s. And of course, the quintessential frequency modulation synthesizer was the Yamaha DX7. And it was a digital synthesizer that had 6 different modulation oscillators that you could configure in various ways to be able to change what was happening with the main oscillator. But all of those, in every case with the Yamaha FM series stuff, it was all sine waves. And the reasoning was because sine waves, when built up like that, created things that were clangorous and dissonant enough. So there was no reason to be able to get into pulse waves and other things. But here, in this world, why not? Let's be able to create, you know, really strange, crazy kinds of sounds using pulse waves. So next thing down here is the modulation index, which I implied before. And this is simply an amplitude knob. So as I turn it up, it just makes the modulation oscillator attack the main oscillator that much more strongly. Let's go into audio range. So that's full blast. And we're back to our sine wave again. Very simple. And just like the rest of this device, we have an attenuverter here to be able to control that modulation index with CV. So let's just use the LFO that we had down below and plug it in. And we'll turn that down a little bit. And we'll turn it up to create positive change. Oop. We can turn the modulation index all the way down, and then the only voltage change that we have is coming in from the LFO. Or we can move the modulation index up, and it'll change around where the amplitude or frequency modulation level already is. And so the more we turn that up, the stronger it gets. And then we can go the other way, and then it'll be subtracting control voltage instead. I almost hear like a resonant sound is in a filter there. So cool, and you can see why this single box has got so much timbral possibility if you just play with it a little bit. There we go with the sawtooth. Nothing, and then... So we're modulating the amount of frequency modulation that the modulator oscillator is affecting the main oscillator by. So that's our main, so that's that middle index there. Okay, so as I was saying, the main oscillator here has got an FM input right there, but that's for plugging in external sounds. We have this nice sort of behind the scenes path where we can do the same thing right here, in which you could consider this the patch cords that are connecting this up to that. However, having said that, we could certainly do the same thing the other way. We could just go and grab the triangle wave output from there, plug it directly into there, and we get the exact same result. So in addition to plugging it into the FM input, we can basically do the same thing by plugging it into the CV input. And we get similar kinds of sounds, which means that we could do something like plugging the LFO into one and really start to get complex kind of frequency modulation. There's the same thing using the square wave, same thing using the sawtooth. Now what's interesting, of course, is we are certainly not limited to just modulating the main oscillator. We can also modulate the modulation oscillator. So what if we go here and use a really slow So we have a really slow sawtooth waveform coming in on an LFO, and you can hear it going along and then all of a sudden jumping. We can do the same thing with a sine wave and make it much slower. And you can hear the sine wave slowing down the frequency modulator. Now that's in LFO rates. Let's move it up to audio rates. And you'll hear that it's changing the harmonics. You're sort of indexing through the harmonics slowly as the sine wave LFO is changing the frequency of the modulation oscillator. Finally, we can do the same thing with the attenuverter on the CV input and change it quite a bit. You can hear there we have it up so far that we've actually changed the scale where it really goes back and forth between audio rate and then down into LFO rate. You can even see the LED flashing there, and then it speeds up to the point where it's in audio rate and you can't see it flashing anymore. So that is how the modulation oscillator works with the main oscillator. Okay, so now we come to the third module within the Verbos Complex Oscillator, and that is the wave shaper right over here. This is absolutely fascinating and allows you once again to be able to create any number of different kinds of sounds coming out of what starts with a simple sine wave right there, okay? So if we take a look down here, we can see that there are 3 different sets of controls to be able to adjust the wave shaping. And the first one on the bottom is the timbre. The second one is a balance between low harmonics and high harmonics. And then the top one is a balance between even harmonics and odd harmonics. And each of those things have a significant effect on the sound. So, to start with, we always have to use the timbre knob because these 2 knobs do absolutely nothing right now or virtually nothing, almost nothing, because we're looking at a sine wave. And a sine wave, by definition, doesn't have any harmonics. So there's nothing for those to work on. So let's create some harmonics. And the way that we do that is by adjusting the timbre knob. As we start turning it up, you can hear that it starts getting brighter. And different harmonics start becoming emphasized. So there it is with the timbre all the way up. Now once again, before we get into the other changes, we can use our good old LFO here to plug in and to adjust that timbre control separately with using the CV input. There we go. Very cool. I'm using negative modulation for it because I already have the timbre all the way up. If we were to move it into the middle, then we could do something more like using positive modulation if we wanted to be able to emphasize more of the brighter sounds. So we're going to turn that off and then go back to having a really rich sound. Now, once we have the timbre knob all the way up, these 2 knobs come into effect. So the first one is the low and high partial balance. So right now it's in the middle. As we move it down, you can hear that the sound is getting a little bit darker, and some of the lower partials are the ones that are being emphasized more. And as we turn it up, we're right about in the middle now, and then we're going to go past the middle up to the top. And you can hear how all of those brighter and buzzier sounds start becoming available and primarily focused on. Oops. So now, just for fun, to show, in fact, exactly how we can use this whole thing, let's forget about using that LFO down there, because we've got an LFO right here. Let's use our modulation oscillator to modulate the way that the low versus high harmonics are being emphasized. And once again, we can move it up into audio range and get more sidebands. So that's how the low and the high harmonics work. Low harmonic emphasis, high harmonic emphasis, and right in the middle. Now, we have a very similar thing with the even odd emphasis. So it's exactly the same thing in the middle. It's an even balance of even and odd harmonics. Let's go towards the even side. And now let's move towards the odd side. Right in the middle. And that's more of a hollow sound to me. So let's experiment once again with using an LFO to be able to go back and forth between them and see what we get. Slow that down. Once again, we can get into audio range and start getting some additional clangorous sidebands there. And all of that's happening without any amplitude or frequency modulation happening at all, right? So this part is turned off right now. We're just using this patch cord to do that. So once again, to go over this wave shaping, it's pretty crazy. We start by turning the timbre all the way down, so we get nothing but a sine wave with no harmonics. Then we can start moving the timbre up and bringing in all of these additional harmonics that, as you can see, shapes the waveform, which is why they call it that. We get it to somewhere we like, and then we can change the emphasis between low and high harmonics. It's almost like using an EQ, right? Not exactly, but same sort of idea. And then finally, we can emphasize between the even and the odd harmonics. And to really get this whole thing going, we can let's modulate the even and the odd harmonics with this LFO. And then let's modulate the low and the high harmonics with this one. Oops. I keep knocking the frequency button. So you can hear, all of a sudden we have a pretty darn complex waveform there that we can start doing stuff with. Okay. The one thing to note is that the wave shaping only works like the amplitude modulation. It only works out of the master output. These are just generating sort of more straight pitch oriented, but incredibly beautiful sounding waveforms as well. So let's cap this by getting everything going at the same time, just to see how complex we can get. We'll start with the timbre all the way down, so we have no wave shaping going on. Let's pull that out. Let's get some amplitude modulation going. And then, so we've got a sawtooth. Here, let's use that. Let's use the triangle. I like that sound a little bit more. And then let's, little by little, change the frequency of the modulator, of the modulating oscillator. So that's pretty interesting. Then let's add the wave shaping. And then work on modulating those a little bit too. And then just for fun, we'll do the same thing with a sawtooth on the even and odd harmonics. And as you move this around, you just get such fascinating and interesting sounds that never seem to repeat each other. There's moving the actual main frequency all the way up. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I present you the Verbos Complex Oscillator. Unbelievably awesome, 100% analog, super cool, additive module. So that's the Verbos Complex Oscillator. I was pretty blown away, and unfortunately now I'm going to want to look through the rest of the Verbos catalog to be able to see what other magnificent modules I can eventually save up for to purchase. That's it for this episode of Under the Big Tree. As always, if you like what we're doing here, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. We always welcome your comments in the comments section below. For now, this is Nick, signing off.